O God, may your spirit and guidance be in us all as we work for the benefit of all our people, for peace and justice in our land, and for the constant recognition of the dignity and aspirations of those whom we serve. Amen.
Amen. Please be seated. Colleagues, I would like to congratulate one of my constituents, Ms. Jenny Lee Benelsi Pascal, on becoming a contestant on the Food Network's new show, Wall of Chefs, which aired last night, February 10th, 2020. Along with 4 other home cooks from across Canada, she competed in a cook-off for $10,000. Originally from Fort McPherson, Jenny Lee, a busy mother of 3, is currently living in Sigachik, overseeing the daycare. Taking part in this series, Jenny Lee has drawn awareness to the protection of the porcupine caribou herd, as well as the protection of the Peel River watershed. A great opportunity for one of our own to be selected for the Wall of Chefs. Jenny Lee has encouraged others to reach for their goals and will be using the skills that she has gained to further her cooking abilities. Once again, congratulations, Jenny Lee. Minister statements. Minister statements. Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Government of the Northwest Territories knows that climate change is an important issue for Northwest Territories residents and all Canadians. That's why strengthening the government's leadership and authority on climate change and ensuring climate change impacts are considered when making government decisions are 2 of the 22 priorities identified by the 19th Legislative Assembly. Climate change affects our environment, our economy, and the traditional way of life. Our communities continue to face impacts to their winter roads, shorelines, and harvesting practices. A long-term and coordinated response to collaboration with all our partners is needed to address climate change in the Northwest Territories. The Department of Environment and Natural Resources is proud to lead this work. The 2030 N.W.T. Climate Change Strategy Framework sets out our government's long-term plans for addressing climate change. This includes action in response to the 2017 report of the Auditor General of Canada. The framework was developed with input from Indigenous governments and organizations, N.W.T. residents and stakeholders, and is a government-wide response to climate change. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to report this work is well underway. Last April, Environment and Natural Resources released the first 5-year climate change action plan under the framework. 95% of the actions led by the Government of the Northwest Territories are either on track or completed. As well, in the last year, the Government of the Northwest Territories has released a Sustainable Livelihood Action Plan to support access to country food and be on the land, funded a number of projects focusing on climate change research, monitoring and adaptation, working with our Indigenous partners to establish 2 N.W.T. protected areas, and deliver a course to bring climate change into community decision-making. This is in addition to the Government of Northwest Territories' work to implement the N.W.T's 2030 energy strategy. Mr. Speaker, these are important accomplishments the Government of the Northwest Territories and our partners should be proud of. Still, we know there is more to be done. That is why, over the next year, we will continue to work with our partners on the Climate Change Action Plan. We look forward to releasing our first annual progress report alongside annual reporting on the 2030 energy strategy. Our government will continue to show leadership on climate change throughout the 19th Legislative Assembly, including the establishment of the N.W.T. Climate Change Council with our Indigenous partners to help guide government actions. Mr. Speaker, relationships are key to advancing this agenda. This means honouring our partnership with Indigenous governments and organizations and sharing what we know about climate change across northern and southern jurisdictions. It also means continue to advocate for federal funding to address climate change and build strong, resilient communities. Environment and Natural Resources remains committed to its leadership role on climate change. We will report on our progress and work together with Northerners to ensure our unique way of life can continue in a changing climate. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Minister statements. Minister statements. Member statements. Member for Thabacha.
Mr. Speaker, for my member statement today, I would like to address the Department of Health and Social Services on their medical travel policy. In the past week, I have dealt with 2 separate cases for intervention. One case dealt with a stage 3 cancer patient and another patient with possible serious outcomes. Both patients were approved for medical escorts by a doctor and then overturned by the medical travel staff here in Yellowknife. This is a very concerning situation for the residents of the N.W.T. Mr. Speaker, the policy is quite vague when it comes to medical travel escort criteria. Worry and trauma for a patient that is authorized for an escort by a doctor should not be interfered with. Providing the best care for people of the N.W.T. should be our priority. Compromising people's well-being is unacceptable. Many people, when facing serious medical problems, do not want to face and fight the department for what they believe is a right. Compassion and respect for a doctor's authority must be respected and honoured. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Thabacha. Member statements. Member statements. Member for N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the Northwest Territories, there are 2,400 people living in public housing units across our 30 communities. Most of these people are good, hard-working people that require housing assistance in most difficult circumstances. I believe our job as a government is to lift these people up, to help improve their situations, and not sit in judgment of them to contribute stigma that is attached to social housing. Mr. Speaker, because of public housing's rent, it's geared on income. Public housing tenants are required to improve their income in their local housing organization, or the LHO. A number of my N.W.T. constituents in public housing are frustrated with N.W.T. Housing Corporation's practice of using T4 slips to confirm their income. As you know, employers provide T4 slips once a year, Mr. Speaker. The purpose of that T4 slip shows that the income was the previous year's and not the current situation that they're in. The practice of using T4 slips is the result of clients being assessed at a much higher level on the rent scale based on past income. When they may be unemployed or seasonal, it's not making nearly as much income as the current time period. To make matters worse, they want to appeal the LHO's decision. Mr. Speaker, it takes 20 days in writing before the decision could be made. As an MLA, I'm getting mighty tired of hearing complaints from my constituents who are running into bureaucratic red tape. The minister says a lot of nice words about the GNWT and is working for the people. But in the front lines, Mr. Speaker, it's a different story. This government has acts like it has the authority to sit in judgment to the poorest, most vulnerable citizens of our territory. It seems like everything can try to prevent people from accessing services rather than helping them. Mr. Speaker, it's time the minister sitting across the floor to commit to putting concept service back into the public service. I urge my cabinet colleagues to show leadership needed to ensure that all GNWT employees put public service first and remember at all times that they're working for the people of the Northwest Territories, and that's who we serve, is the people of the Northwest Territories and not the other way around. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for N.W.T. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Detroit.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation has a number of housing programs for the benefit of residents. If you have access to a computer, one only need to look on the internet, find the N.W.T. Housing Corporation website, and continue navigating to see the various programs and services available. This is if you have access to a computer and are computer literate. Mr. Speaker, for the people that don't understand how to navigate the internet or even have access to a phone, it is very trying and frustrating, to say the least, in finding what the N.W.T. Housing Corporation has to offer in terms of their programs and services. I understand a few years ago, the local housing organizations were funded by the Quorum's advisor position. This person assisted people with information on the programs available, the services, and provided assistance with the various applications and forms. Sadly, the positions were phased out of the small communities and at the same time losing much needed local employment. Mr. Speaker, I will have questions for the Housing Minister at the appropriate time. Merci.
Thank you, Member for Detroit. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Nuvik-Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are closing in on 9 months since the final report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls was released. In that report, Mr. Speaker, are calls for justice that are crying out to be fully implemented and real action to be taken by all levels of government in order to have the calls for justice realized. The final report speaks to many issues that we have already been discussing in our 19th Assembly. Indigenous rights in Section 1, our priorities list settling land claims and implementing UNDRIP. Indigenous culture and language in Section 2. We are losing our language and our own people are being forced to answer the phones in our government departments in French. Health and wellness in Section 3. Equitable access for all in our communities. Human security in Section 4. We have a lack of shelters and transitional housing in our communities, with the North having the highest rate of violence against women. And I'll jump over to Section 11, which talks about education and educators to be teaching Indigenous history, law, and practices from Indigenous perspectives, and the use of their voices will guide us with children and youth. Section 12 speaks to the Child and Family Services, which at this time has 100% Indigenous kids in the care of N.W.T. Correctional Service. In this section, 100% of the women incarcerated in the N.W.T. are Indigenous. And from the recent CBC, we know that over 80% of the males incarcerated are Indigenous. How can we integrate them back into the community with supports? Mr. Speaker, the full implementation of the calls for justice is key to helping to ensure that our women and girls are safe and protected in Canada and here at home in the N.W.T. The report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls cannot and will not be put on a shelf or referenced with just words, Mr. Speaker. It demands full implementation and respect to those families who put their trust in this inquiry, Mr. Speaker. And I will have questions for the Minister responsible for status of women later.
Thank you, Member for Nuvik-Twin Lakes. Member statements. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the largest population of seniors in the N.W.T. lives in Yellowknife, and their numbers continue to grow. In fact, elders are the fastest growing segment of our population. Services for them have not kept pace with growing needs. As an example, we are now in our 4th year without a social inclusion program for older adults. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to provide some background on this issue. Loneliness is a major issue for older adults, for all kinds of reasons, including health, mobility, income, and transportation. Seniors may spend a lot of time at home alone. Some may choose to feel more connected to their community by taking part in social activities. Providing social activities is a key support for elders who want to stay in their own homes. Assisting seniors to age in place is a priority of this Assembly, but they need additional supports to make this a reality. Mr. Speaker, adults who need this service are generally divided into two groups. Elders who are physically frail are one group, while those with cognitive issues such as dementia comprise the other group. Avens used to host a program that got elders out of the house to enjoy activities and companionship and gave their caregivers a few hours off. But Avens found it difficult to serve both groups at once and decided to close their program in 2016. Mr. Speaker, since then, the Department of Health and Social Services has been working on a replacement. One non-for-profit offered an adult day program for a few months before deciding it wasn't feasible for them to continue. The department has advertised twice for a service provider but got no takers. The latest initiative was a survey of seniors about their social activities that took place in August. Mr. Speaker, I am part of the target group, so I completed the survey as well. The questions were simple and focused on how much social activity I wanted and what activities interested me. As I was sitting at my computer, I wondered how many older adults, who may be much older than I am, have a computer and filled in the survey. I also wondered how many with dementia would be able to complete the survey. Mr. Speaker, the previous minister was committed to finding a solution to helping older adults meet their social needs. I'm hopeful that the new minister will make that same commitment to Yellowknife seniors. I will have questions for her. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife Centre. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Haverhill South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the 2013 N.W.T. Economic Opportunity Strategy prepared by this government, it identified the Great Slave commercial fishery as a priority opportunity to advance regional economic development and diversification. The 18th Assembly then followed up with developing a strategy for revitalizing the Great Slave Lake commercial fishery. Mr. Speaker, the strategy from the 18th Legislative Assembly has the expectation that lake production will increase by encouraging Northerners and Aboriginal persons to enter the fishery, and further through the relocation of new fishing assets and fishers from Alberta to Great Slave Lake with the promise of higher prices. Mr. Speaker, currently we have several grant and contribution programs to assist our N.W.T. fishers. These programs are designed to assist N.W.T. fishers who require financial assistance with various business components that include costs related to startup, freight, equipment, packaging, marketing, and capital investment. Mr. Speaker, these grants and contributions are for our N.W. commercial fishers who reside in the N.W.T. on a permanent basis. Access to the program is clearly set out in the GNW's own commercial renewable resource use policies. The policy states that only a Northern resident may access the program, and goes on to define a Northern resident as a person who has been ordinarily resident in N.W.T. for at least 3 years. I am pleased to see we have set this residency requirement at 3 years, as it does provide some protection for the limited funding available to our N.W.T. fishers. It is important that we protect that funding from fishers who do not meet the residency requirements. Mr. Speaker, I look to this government to first promote and support Indigenous peoples and Northerners who want to enter the commercial fishing industry in the N.W.T. This is who the contribution and grants are for. They are not for Southern fishers who reside in the South or do not have a bona fide interest in the N.W.T. If we want economic diversification, then let us reach out to the Indigenous peoples of the N.W.T. and our Northern residents to encourage and support their entry into the commercial fishing industry, and not continue to look south for the answers. I would request that this government take care of its own by following the policies it has established. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Haverhill South. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Tunadee-Willding.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are at a time when schools are facing budget shortfalls and are needing to either cut services or programs. I really don't understand why ECE does not allow for budget surpluses to be carried over and utilized by schools at the start of a new fiscal year. Presently, when the fiscal year is coming to an end and there happens to be monies left over that was not spent, It is mandatory for all school boards to hand back all leftover money to the Department of Education, Culture and Employment or to the FMB, depending on the surplus amount. Mr. Speaker, I strongly disagree with this way of doing business. I believe we could be better utilizing our leftover education dollars. Why not allow schools to spend this leftover money to use how they see fit? And after all, these allocated funds were budgeted for their use. So I don't see why we can't allow them to carry over any unspent money into the new fiscal year. Mr. Speaker, if schools were able to carry over these surplus funds and spend it as they saw fit, I believe our schools would be better off because of it. Just think of it, schools be in a better position to plan for long-term spending on things like new support staff, funding bus services, or simply buying new classroom supplies, such as computers for students. And in closing, we had this scathing Auditor General report on education in the North. I think that we need to be innovative, and we need to do in our youth, in the spirit of our youth, to assist them wherever they can. So with that, I will have some questions for the appropriate minister in a short while. Mr. Speaker.
Massey, member for Tuna-Day Welday. Member statements. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. In March 2017, the Department of Health and Social Services released its Caring for Our People strategic plan for the Northwest Territories Health and Social Services system. The vision laid out in that document is, quote, best health, best care, best future, end of quote, with one of the goals being, quote, care and services are responsive to children, individuals, families, and communities, end of quote. Following a complaint from a constituent, I was advised by the Minister of Health and Social Services that in July 2019, Stanton Territorial Hospital changed its practice with respect to support people accompanying pregnant women in the ultrasound room. The support person was no longer able to accompany a patient into the sonogram room. I was told that this change was based on the Sonography Canada Professional Practice Guidelines, which were updated in September 2018. I've reviewed that document and can find nothing against the use of family members as chaperones. The guidelines state, quote, a chaperone will ideally be a member of staff, but in some departments and circumstances, a member of staff with chaperone training may not be available, and institutional or facility policies may allow a relative or friend of the patient to be used as a comforter, care, or informal chaperone if this is acceptable to both the patient and the practitioner involved, end of quote. Given that our healthcare system is supposed to be client-centered and moving towards cultural safety, the current practice of excluding family members, especially fathers, during ultrasounds would seem to run counter to our stated vision and goals. I will have questions later today for the Minister of Health and Social Services regarding the policy and practice of ultrasounds at Stanton Territorial Hospital, which is in my Frame Lake riding. Must see, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Frame Lake. Member statements. Member for Cam Lake.
Mr. Speaker, for the last 40 years, Canadians have determined core housing needs based on adequacy, suitability, and affordability. Core housing refers to a national set of measures developed in collaboration with the United States. Based on core housing metrics, in 2019, over 50% of housing in small communities required major repairs, and in Yellowknife, our greatest challenge was affordability. 1 in 3 Yellowknifers are spending more than 30% of their household income on housing costs, and over 900 people are currently on the wait list for public housing across the N.W.T. Things are getting worse, Mr. Speaker. In 2009, 32% of the N.W.T. had at least one housing problem. In 2019, a decade later, that number has risen to 43%. Our needs are growing. Our housing is aging and becoming inadequate according to core measures. Understand that what is measured defines the crisis. When housing, community wellness, economic prosperity, education, and personal health are all linked, are we really measuring the right things? When Northern housing is now linked to the National Housing Strategy, to human and Indigenous rights, and to global sustainability, are we really measuring the right things? While Canadian jurisdictions race to be the first at the table for billions in federal housing dollars, the Anishinaabe Nation's Chief in Assembly started creating their own modern self-determined housing strategy. This strategy will define housing needs based on community values and priorities and will work toward creative, community-based solutions to solve the housing crisis. This strategy was born in response to housing programs that are not meeting their needs today, have not addressed future needs of changing demographics, and do not promote or create community wellness. This acknowledges that a more holistic approach to housing is needed. This holistic approach challenges the narrow metrics of the core housing policies and includes new, more meaningful data. This approach focuses on how everything is connected. Our 4-year mandate recognizes a half-dozen initiatives related directly to building homes and thriving communities. To increase effectiveness, to save money, to focus our efforts, these initiatives must work together. On Friday, the Premier acknowledged conversations committing this Cabinet to work with the Indigenous governments to secure funding from the federal government. This is a great beginning. We must also work across all levels of government, all sectors, and NGOs to tell a new story of dwelling in this land. I'd like to ask. Seek consent to continue, please, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Cam Lake. The member is seeking unanimous consent to conclude her statement. Are there any nays? There are no nays. You may conclude your statement.
This is a great beginning. We must work across all levels of government, all sectors, and NGOs to tell a new story of dwelling in this land. We need robust, funded plans to achieve it through integrated community land use stewardship, community renewable energy plans, housing and community wellness metrics, and reconciliation planning. With our whole social system engaged at the table, facing new issues in a new way. We need to start measuring what matters. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Cam Lake. Member statements. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I would like to speak about the iron law of bureaucracy, a term coined by Jerry Purnell, a researcher of Legacy Institution. The law states, in any bureaucratic organization, there will be two kinds of people: those who work to further the actual goals of the organization and those who work for the organization itself. Examples in the N.W.T would be those who work hard and sacrifice their time to serve our public, and I thank them for that. Versus those who avoid accountability, consider their main role to push paper and ensure they hold the department record for being CC'd on the most emails. The iron law states that in all cases, the type of person whose primary goal is to climb a bureaucratic ladder as opposed to serve the public will always gain control of the organization and will always write the rules under which the organization functions. This is the challenge of legacy institutions, Mr. Speaker, such as government. If government were a business, it would have failed long ago. It would have been forced to declare bankruptcy and try again with new ideas. Yet government bankruptcy, despite what our fiscal situation might say, is not an option. And Mr. Speaker, I wish to clarify, government can't be run on profit motive. And all of our goals in this House is to have the N.W.T succeed, not fail. But if we are not speaking honestly about problems that persist in any legacy institution, then we cannot serve our citizens. And this is not me speaking, Mr. Speaker. There is no shortage of research on solutions on how to address systemic problems in public service institutions. Mr. Speaker, one way in which the iron law is solidified is the avoidance of making decisions, also known as paralysis by analysis. The reality is we all have to make decisions in uncertainty. There will always be trade-offs. We can't pretend we live in a perfect world with all of the data. And if you're in a department and the 6th briefing note on a subject has been requested, perhaps it is time to just make a decision. And Mr. Speaker, I struggle with this because on this side of the House we constantly ask for more power, for more input, for more information. Yet, we all have to realize that the goal here is to empower the experts in our departments to make decisions, to empower those on the front line to serve our citizens. And it may at times ruffle some feathers, but it is our job to make those tough decisions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife North. Member statements. Member for Mumfway.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to speak on
the Winter Road and all round access road, and they signed the agreement last year. That was February 14 that they signed this agreement with the N.W.T and the Clinchon company, Clinchon government, and also the company that's going to do the work. It started last fall. I want to make a statement on that.
Speaker, on February 14, 2019, on Valentine's Day last year of this week, the N.W.T government signed an agreement with the Clinchon government and a project company for the construction of 97-kilometer road that will connect N.W.T to Highway 3. Mr. Speaker, the construction costs for the road are expected to reach $213.8 million, while the overall P3 contract to design, build, finance, operate, maintain a cost of $411.8 million over a 25-year period. Mr. Speaker, to date, there are 137 workers on site, and there are 49 Clinchon citizens working there. Out of these, 5 were hired as heavy equipment operators, 2 as mechanics, 23 in general labor area, 18 truck drivers. There are also 18 northern workers from YELLOWKNIFE commuting. And get this, Mr. Speaker, 70 non-N.W.T workers at site. That's 51% of 137 workers being non-N.W.T from the south. Mr. Speaker, the construction site is located in the heart of Wick-Asia boundary, a Mofiga Denitle boundary. By rights, the construction agreement should directly benefit the local Bishakon and Clinchon communities, as opposed to a southern firm, a southern non-N.W.T workers. As my former colleague would put it, it's a crying shame to allow outsiders to take all the benefits. Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Mumphy. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think that anybody that knows me prior to this role in my life is not going to be surprised at the topic of my member statement today. On December 22nd, 2015, the United Nations declared passed a resolution to declare February 11th the International Day of Women and Girls in Science. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart as an engineer. I've worked tirelessly over the last decade to promote and advocate for women in STEM, so I just wanted to share with the members and the Assembly some statistics around women in STEM in Canada. In 2016, women made up 34% of STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and math, bachelor's degree holders, and 23% of science and technology workers among Canadians aged 25 to 64. And in my specific professional area of engineering, women only account for 12% of all professional engineers. Most women who departed from STEM did so early in their studies. By the start of their second year, 17% of women in STEM had either switched to non-science-based programs or left undergraduate degrees altogether. Between then and the start of the third year, another 10% left. Among Canadian educated workers aged 25 to 34, 54% of women with a bachelor's degree in computer and information sciences worked in science and technology occupations, compared with 74% of men. Despite extensive research and a high degree of policy concern, Canada's progress on improving women's representation in STEM is very uneven. In 2016, women's representation among Canadian educated STEM bachelor's degree holders was 36% for 30-year-olds, similar to 37% for 40-year-olds, and then both figures were much higher than with women's share of 22% for 65-year-olds. Women, though, one stat that is in our favor, we graduated faster than the men did from STEM programs, regardless of the field of study. For example, 27% of women and 16% of men who started out in computer and information sciences completed a STEM degree within 4 years. I just wanted to take the opportunity to mark the day, as it is something that I feel very passionately about, and I wanted to, again, as we've all been hearing lots throughout this session and the first one, I'm very proud to be part of such a radically changed Assembly and showing a new face of governance in Canada. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Member for Great Slave. Member statements. Member statements. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Members, I'd like to welcome those that are tuned in on television and on Facebook. We are gaining more and more people following our proceedings. Thank you. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Report of committees on the review of bills. Report of committees on the review of bills. Reports of standing and special committees. Reports of standing and special committees. Returns to oral questions. Returns to oral questions. Acknowledgments. Acknowledgments. Oral questions. Member for Mumfree.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I spoke earlier about the Clinton all-season road to N.W.T. I'd like to ask the Minister of Infrastructure, just how certain is the Minister that the contractor has met all the requirement for Clinton construction labor and Clinton business operation as outlined in a contract signed between the three parties? Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Mumfree. Minister responsible for infrastructure.
It's my understanding from the department that the contractor is meeting all of their requirements under the negotiated contract, or the contract for employment of hiring of Clecho citizens. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Mumfree.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that leads into my next question. I understand there's been some changes in catering contractors at the site. How is it a catering contractor at site wound up in the hands of American firm, Aramark American Catering Company, that's on site right now? Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Mumfree. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not 100% sure of the question, if it's just to ask that an American company has ended up on site. It's my understanding that the way the contract was worded, it was about employment of Clecho citizens, not of that specific company. However, I could clarify that for the member and return with a written answer if you'd like. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Mumfree.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we're talking about two areas, the hiring and also business opportunity. This is a business opportunity from Clinton companies, local companies, but they missed that opportunity. Mr. Speaker, I'll move on to a third question. I'm assuming, as with any other government contract, process were followed to favor northern hires, northern businesses. What was the process that allowed just a non-Clinton, not just a non-N.W.T, but rather an American firm to serve on the to service the Clinton all-season road project, especially when you're operating in a multi boundary, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Mumfree. Minister of Infrastructure.
Speaker, I would agree with the member that we've all had lots of discussions around ensuring that northern businesses are used on northern contracts. I can't speak to the specifics of knowing in this particular contract details, but it is my understanding from the department that this has all been within the contract that was set forward and negotiated between the Government of the Northwest Territories and the Clecho, as well as the third party. So it's my understanding that that was all decided upon together as a group. I am concerned to hear of businesses that are coming from not only southern Canada but from the US and taking work. It's definitely something I spoke to during my campaign, and all I can do is commit to the member that we will look at this and learn lessons from this and move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary. Member for Mumfree.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I still can't believe this day and age that we're allowing an American firm operating on our traditional land. It's very difficult to accept. But I'd like to proceed with the next question is the project meeting the commitments to use a minimum participation rate of Northern and Indigenous participation? Who's monitoring this? Merci.
Thank you, Member for Mumfree. Minister of Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, it is my understanding from the department that yes, they are meeting the requirements of the contract for Northern and Clecho engagement or employment. However, I will commit to the member, if you would like to have a further discussion with the department, we can bring departmental staff and we can have a conversation about the monitoring that's happening to assure the member that we are committed to engaging and working with Northern companies and Northern employees. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Decho.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions are related to the N.W.T. Housing Corporation program delivery to the communities and directed to the Housing Minister. Can the Minister ensure district program advisors are visiting the communities on a more frequent basis to advise of the housing programs and services that are available to the people?
Thank you, Member for Decho. Minister responsible for the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Member, for your statement. Mr. Speaker, I will commit to having my programs advisors visit the regional offices, the community offices going forward. We do have a significant amount of programs and services that we do deliver for the Housing Corporation, or as the Housing Corporation, but right now we are going forward and we are looking at advertisements so then we're able to meet the needs of the Northwest Territories through our program delivery. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Member, for your question.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Decho.
Mr. Speaker, and to the Minister for that answer. We've had program advisors visit the community recently before the holidays there, but they weren't taking down specific information on people that approached them for their program delivery. So that wasn't being followed through. Can the Minister ensure district program advisors are available to assist potential clients with the onerous applications process?
Thank you, Member for Decho. Minister responsible for the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Member, for your statement. I'm quite surprised to hear that the programs advisors are not seeing the applications thoroughly, and they're not meeting the satisfaction of the clients coming to the programs advisors. I will ensure to the member that when the district officers come into the community, that we do end up with a report. A status report. I want to know what those community visits were like. I want to know how many applications were received and if they were completed or else if there was some information that we're missing. But I'll ensure that the programs advisors are following up and we are accountable as a Northwest Territories Housing Corporation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Member, for your comments.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Decho.
Mr. Speaker. In my member statement, I alluded to the fact that the LHOs had program advisors previously. Can the Minister advise as to when we may see program advisors continue back into our communities?
Thank you, Member for Decho. Minister responsible for the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Member, for your question. Going forward, I've realized that we have an increase of population within our communities, and that program delivery is in our increase of public housing units. There is a need for more positions within our communities. I will be looking forward into this question because it is a concern to me that we do have the number of units on the ground, but the number of employees we have currently, we need to review that. So going forward, I will follow up with the member with the changes that we will be making throughout the district offices, the community offices, the local housing authorities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Member, for your question.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, Member for Decho.
Mr. Speaker, for the Minister for stating that she will look into the position. Every year we're always having problems with seniors and other people not being able to access a lot of the programs. There's no advertising in the communities or on the radios, and we're always having the staff at the LHOs, we're always directing clients to Hay River office because we don't have anyone in our community to help with those. Because it's important for the seniors, they're always missing the end dates, or it's too late in the winter for servicing furnaces and whatever else is required. And so it's important to have those staff people on the ground in our communities that can help maybe go door to door to really assist people. Masicho.
Thank you, Member for Detroit. I didn't hear a question, but the Minister wants to respond.
Thank you, Member, for your comment. Going forward, it's I'm looking at the program services that we offer at the local housing authority and the district offices, and looking at, I guess it's kind of disturbing, I guess, to hear that all the programs are not being met, and we're not able to, and we're not getting out to the clients that require the services that the Housing Corporation has to offer. Going forward, I have instructed my department, the district offices, to be meeting with the local housing authorities monthly, and going forward and looking at that and wanting to meet the needs of each of the community membership. Looking at the seniors as well too in the programs, and looking at the dates that they are missing. I would like to like the member to provide me with a names of the clients, and I would have my department follow up with that as soon as possible. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, member, for your statement. For your question.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. My questions are for the Minister of Health and Social Services. Can the Minister tell this House what the current policy and practice is for ultrasounds at Stanton Territorial Hospital with regard to family members being present during the procedure? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Currently, family members and support persons are being allowed into the ultrasound room unless there's a specific medical reason for which this would not be appropriate. Stanton has committed to continue to monitor the situation to ensure that this approach is being applied consistently. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that, because I had a constituent confirm to me that as recently as December that was not the case. So I look forward to the Minister carrying out the new practice. But in July of 2019, the practice of allowing family members was changed so that family members could not be in the same room as a patient that was getting an ultrasound. So why was that practice changed in July of 2019? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The change was based on updated sonographic Canada professional practice guidelines and feedback from the diagnostic imaging staff. This approach is evolving to become the standard practice in Canada. And at the time it was implemented, it was viewed by the diagnostic imaging department to be an internal procedural change. It is recognized, however, that this was short-sighted and did not necessarily anticipate the viewpoint and concerns to the public. As such, Stanton has committed to properly engage with practitioners, patients, community stakeholders to discuss the intent of the practice change and impact it may have. Ultrasounds are medical exams that require full attention of the sonographers. Additional people in the room can make the exam more challenging. The intention was to allow the sonographer to complete the medical portion of the exam first, before inviting the patient's family into the room to show them and provide them with a photo of the baby. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that explanation. Look, it's great that our staff are, and I know that they work very hard at Stanton Hospital, but clearly when a policy like this is decided internally, it's probably not in the best interest of the patients. So I've reviewed these, the Sonography Canada Professional Practice Guidelines. In fact, I quoted from them in my member statement. They were released in September of 2018, and there was nothing in there about Northern Healthcare or any specific guidance to exclude family members during an ultrasound. So would the minister confirm that the guidelines that I just referenced and she's referenced do not prevent family members from being present during an ultrasound? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sonography Canada Professional Practice Guidelines are considered best practice source of information to inform and to guide the development and/or revision of the NTSSA policies and procedures with respect to the provisions of the ultrasound and Stanton and throughout the NTSSA. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. So clearly the practice of excluding family members during an ultrasound is contrary to best health, best care, better future. That's the vision of the strategic plan we have in place for N.W.T. Health and Social Services system and the concept of cultural safety. So there's nothing in the guidelines that prevent family members from being there. So what is the minister going to do in terms of developing a policy for chaperones for patients undergoing an ultrasound in the N.W.T., and how soon will we see that in place? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Stanton's Diagnostic Imaging Department will be working to engage and communicate this change to external stakeholders, such as practitioners, patients, community stakeholders, such as the Centering Pregnancy programs, to ensure all points of view are captured. This engagement and communication is expected to be completed in spring 2020, and feedback obtained will be taken into consideration when developing policy that allows the sonographer to complete the obstetrical ultrasound in a manner that allows them to provide the best medical results and patient care. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Trinity-Willoughby.
Mr. Speaker, this question is directed to the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment. I spoke a little bit about budget surpluses in my member statement, and my question is, in the spirit of giving our district education authorities more budget autonomy, will the Minister commit to let any DEA surpluses in our riding to roll over this year? Mr. Chair.
Thank you, member for Trinity-Willoughby. Minister responsible for Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the member bringing this up. It's good to get this type of information out to the public. I know that when I was a regular member, and even now as a minister, there seems to be difficulty communicating with the people on the ground, with the boards, about the roles and responsibilities and the rights of education authorities. So the policy that the member is referencing was enacted to ensure that money that is provided by this assembly for education is spent on education. And it allows for a surplus carryover that's either 7% of audited revenue or $250,000, whichever is greater. If this amount is exceeded, the education body has to put forward a plan on how they're going to reduce that, and that plan comes to me. And I want to let the minister know that I'm very flexible in how I'm going to administer this. If there's a real need for an education authority to set aside money in order to do something like purchase school buses, then I'll have that conversation. They can write to myself, write to the department, and we can begin that process. So we don't really claw money back. There's never been a situation where ECE has decided we're going to take money back. Every plan has been approved so far. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Trinity-Willoughby.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know if there's any foreshadowing here, but did I just get a promotion to minister? Just saying.
Nice try.
No? Okay, I just want to make sure. Thank you for the minister for his response. So I just want to make sure that there's more communication as well to you, and to have more meetings with our DEAs, just to make sure there's the open lines of communications, and to make sure I don't have to come back here and ask these questions, and to have more to work as a team. So my next question, will the minister be open to work with our DEAs to grant their wishes and find ways to keep any of these surpluses?
For Tunde Welde, Minister of EC&E.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague, and that's why I try and say colleague all the time, because we're all equal here. There's no promotions. We're all here to represent the public. I'm happy to work with the education authorities to find ways to ensure that they can use their funds to deliver education in the best possible way. We also have to look at the fact that the funding from ECE is provided to the Education Council, and the Education Council is the one that then distributes it to the education authorities. And so there's another level here that we have to look at, and perhaps the way it's distributed by the education councils leaves some authorities with more funding than others. And so it's not so black and white, but like I said, I'm happy to have those conversations, and to the member's point, or to my colleague's point, I am trying to do a better job of communicating directly with the DEAs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Tunde Welde. Oh, sorry. Okay. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My questions are for the Minister responsible for status of women, and before I get started with my questions, I just want the Minister to know that I have read the Doing Our Part initial response to the final report of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Can the Minister advise us if she has read the calls for justice? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Twin Lakes. Minister responsible for the status of women.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like the member to know that it has been printed, it's on my desk, and I will start reading it. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for being honest. Can the Minister tell us what steps the N.W.T is taking to fully implement the calls for justice outlined in this Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Twin Lakes. Minister responsible for the status of women.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. An interdepartmental Missing Murdered Indigenous Working Group was set up to coordinate the N.W.T's response to calls for justice. This working group is chaired by the Special Advisor to the Minister responsible for status of women, and it includes appointed representatives from departments such as Justice, Executive and Indigenous Affairs, Health and Social Services, Education, Culture and Employment, as well as the Housing Corporation. Other departments are invited to attend to the meetings as required. This working group will be doing an in-depth review and analyze the calls for justice. A time frame has not been established for the completion of this review, but it is anticipated that it will require detailed discussions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Has the Minister had a chance to directly speak to those who are responsible for the National Action Plan since being elected to ensure appropriate and sustainable and long-term funding is available to the N.W.T to fully implement these calls for justice? And if not, will the Minister commit to this government and all ministers to lobby Canada for their federal counterparts to ensure long-term sustainable funding is provided to ensure full implementation for calls to justice? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Twin Lakes. Minister responsible for the status of women.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've attended the provincial, federal, territorial status of women. And in the meetings, we talked about having commitment to look forward to going through the review. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Nuvik-Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In light of this new issue, like with the government being a minority government, I'm afraid that if we don't get moving on this issue sooner than later, that if there is a chance that the next government, if our minority federal government changes, that we may not have good strength and movement on this. So I would like the minister to commit that she would push harder and get more familiar with this so that we can get commitments from our federal partners. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Nuvik-Twin Lakes. Minister responsible for the status of women.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Absolutely. That is my intent, and I do, the member has brought up in the House several times and has also made it her commitment, and that is something I will commit to looking into. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the N.W.T. Housing Corporation Minister. Can the Minister confirm that LHOs have been instructed to use T4 slips to do tenant assessments? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Nunukput. Minister responsible for the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, the Housing Corporation has been instructed to use T4 slips for their rental scale. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Nunukput.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, are there any other forms of proof, such as current pay, monthly, current ways of paying, using pay stubs or monthly income support for more accurate rental payment assessment for that month? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Nunukput. Minister responsible for the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to advise that I would encourage the client to be going into our local housing authority office to receive a rental assessment and to make sure that they may remain consistency, but it is the client's responsibility to make sure that if they have any changes in their income, that they report it to the local housing authority. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Nunukput.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, where can the public find, because I couldn't find it, Mr. Speaker, in the N.W.T. Housing Corporation's policies, so all the bureaucratic requirements are clearly understood in regards to the T4s. Where does it show in legislation that that's to be used? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Nunukput. Minister responsible for the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That is the details are outlined in our policy. I don't have my information in front of me to reference it right now. We do not work through legislation. The Housing Corporation works through policy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary. Member for Nunukput.
Mr. Speaker, it's pretty tough when people have to come in and do T4s because they do seasonal work. You're working probably 4 months, and then they come back home, and then the assessment that they're given, they still have to pay for the whole 12 months of that at that higher rate, where their people are having problems paying power, food, clothing for their kids. Why isn't this government wanting to? Never did this before in the past, Mr. Speaker, in regards to in the policies. Where does it show in the policies in regards to T4 slips? It doesn't show. Can the Minister provide that information to the House? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Nunukput. Minister responsible for the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In regards to the policy of outlining the T4 slips in our rental scale, I will have to get back to the member and provide him the information. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned in my statement, helping seniors to age in place is a priority for this Assembly, but we need to improve supports for them to make this priority a reality. One area that needs work is helping Yellowknife seniors to get out of the house and socialize, whatever their physical and cognitive abilities. The Department of Health and Social Services surveyed seniors about the kind of activities they would like to take part in, and today I have questions for the Minister about the results. First of all, what did seniors say they need in order to participate in social activities? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife Centre. Minister responsible for the Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The results indicated that older adults in Yellowknife are active and want to remain physically and socially active. All the age groups identified transportation, affordability of activities, and a lack of information about social activities as a barrier to social engagement. By far, the biggest concern was transportation. City bus not being available when activities are scheduled, routines are not close enough to home, and numerous challenges with the Yellowknife accessible transit services. In addition, those 75 years and older identify lack of accessibility within buildings, lack of supports and physical and mental health needs as barriers to social engagement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's good information from the Minister. Can the Minister give us a sense of what kind of response rate they got to the survey, and particularly from those who are over 80 and those who may have cognitive limitations? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife Centre. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We did not ask individuals whether they had cognitive limitations, so we do not have that data. The age group set up for the survey allowed us to capture information for individuals 75 to 85 years old and 85 plus years old of age. 45 individuals 75 years and older responded to the survey. That was 10% of the survey respondents. 40 people were 75 to 84 years of age, and 8 people were 85 years and older. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm a little concerned about how the needs of people with cognitive issues were taken into account in this survey. How was this survey? How were they engaged in this survey? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife Centre. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I don't know the data on the limitations, but it's something we can look into and get back to the member. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, now that the Minister knows that the primary barrier to people being involved in social inclusion is transportation, what are her next steps to bridge this gap? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife Centre. Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the department will use the information to develop programming that will put in place support for older adults in Yellowknife, and that includes transportation. We're in the early stages of designing the program and be working with the steering committee to complete it by the end of March 2020. The Health Authority will go through an expression of interest process to find an organization to deliver programming, and we're aiming to have this completed in early April so that we can start to begin the program. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Haver South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have to respect the work that the N.W.T. fishers do and the product they deliver to us. And this is why that we have contributions and grants to assist them with the associated high costs of doing business. Mr. Speaker, can the Minister of ITI confirm the total grants and contribution and subsidies for the commercial fishing industry? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Hay River South. Minister responsible for industry, tourism and investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I can confirm for the member that in 2018-2019, a little over $565,000 was provided to the Northwest Territories Fishermen's Federation in varying supports. The Northwest Territories commercial fishing industry is eligible to receive funding and support from ITI in two different areas. The Great Slave Lake Fisheries Support Program, which is specifically for commercial fishers on Great Slave Lake and primarily to offset freight costs from Hay River to the Freshwater Fish Marketing Corporation plant in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And the second one is the Northern Food Development Program. As entrepreneurs and small businesses, fishers are also eligible to apply for funding from the Support for Entrepreneurs and Economic Development Program, or the SEED program, which many already do. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Hay River South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The N.W.T. fishers depend on these grants and contributions to offset those high costs. Can the Minister of ITI confirm what percentage of these contributions go to the N.W.T. fishers and, if any, to fishers outside the N.W.T. who have not met the residency requirement? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Hay River South. Minister of ITI.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I can tell you that all of the SEED and Northern Food Development Program funding went to resident and Northwest Territories fishers. For these two programs, you must be a resident of the Northwest Territories to be eligible for funding. Applicants are required to produce a valid driver's license or health care card. When it comes to the Great Slave Lake Fishery Support Program, all fishers who hold a commercial fishing license on Great Slave Lake, a current boat certificate, and sell fish to the Northwest Territories Fishers Federation fish plant are eligible to receive support under the Freight Support Stream. This program pays out based on the poundage of fish delivered to the plant. Under this program, there was one non-resident fisher who received contributions last year, totaling about 2.5% of the total payout to fishers. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Hay River South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With respect to the residency requirement, there seems to be a difference, I guess, between what's in the SEED program and what's in the commercial renewable resource use policy. The SEED program requires 6 months, and the other one is 3 years. So I'm just wondering if the Minister has looked at that and if the Minister is willing to reconcile that difference, because I'd rather see the money stay in the North, and I'd rather see it be 3 years than the 6-month requirement, due to the fact that it's pretty easy to get a driver's license here and it's pretty easy to get health care here. And anybody could do it and take our money and leave. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Hay River South. Minister of ITI.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the member raising this concern to me. It is not an area that I would express to be very familiar with. And when I did hear of the discrepancies in the residency requirements, it does make me ask the same question as the member. I have not had a chance to follow up with ITI on the reasoning behind why a 6-month residency versus 3 years for the fishers. I do commit to getting back to the member with that answer, as well as committing to a general overall review of most of the programs or all the programs I have in my departments, which I'm getting started on. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, Member for Hay River South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Due to the high costs associated with the fishing industry, can the Minister of ITI confirm if these grants, contribution, and subsidies be revisited at some point to determine if they accurately reflect the high cost associated with that industry? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Hay River South. Minister of ITI.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, to the member's question, the department has and will continue to review all of its funding programs to determine if they are meeting their objectives. Members may or may not be aware that during the 18th Assembly, the support for N.W.T. fishers under the Great Slave Lake Fishery Program was revisited, and in fact it doubled from $225,000 to $450,000. Right now, we are of the opinion that the programs and services offered to Northwest Territories fishers are adequate. In fact, our jurisdiction is among the best in Canada when it comes to supporting individual fishers. More importantly, though, Mr. Speaker, we are working with the Tucho Cooperative to realize a vision that we share for the revitalization of the Great Slave Lake fishing industry. It will position the Tucho Cooperative to ensure that the Northwest Territories producers see the benefit of having a direct say and even ownership in their industry. With increased demand, access to higher markets and pricing, and new products, we want to realize greater returns for new and lifelong fishers working on the lake. Rather than subsidies and grants, we see this as a way to increase opportunities and returns in the fishing sector. I'd also like to acknowledge, I understand there are concerns within the fishing industry in Hay River, and I do commit to the member to further discussions with him going forward to ensure we work on those together. Thank you.
Minister, oral questions. Member for Thabacha.
Mr. Speaker, nowhere in the medical travel policy does it mention whether the minister or any government worker has the ability to overturn a doctor's recommendation for a non-medical escort. So my question is, under what authority does medical travel personnel have the ability to deny a non-medical escort despite a doctor telling the patient otherwise?
Thank you. Member for Thabacha. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question. This is often a misunderstood issue, and it provides me with an opportunity to clarify the role of the clinicians in the administration of medical travel benefits. While our clinicians have an integral role with respect to medical travel, such as making a valid medical referral for the patient and making a recommendation for the escort. Medical travel assistance is a benefit program offered by our government and administered by our medical travel staff. The medical travel policy does not give our clinician full authority over escort decisions. The criteria for non-medical escorts are stated in the policy, and recommendations for an escort must be aligned with our criteria of the policy. In June 2019, the Minister of Health and Social Services issued a directive formalizing the delegation of the implementation and administration of medical travel policies, excluding the appeals policy, to the NTSSA by the Deputy Minister of Health and Social Services. The directive states that the NTSA, through the Medical Travel Office, coordinates the medical travel program for all of the Northwest Territories, including Hay River and the Clecho. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Thabacha.
Mr. Speaker, the person who denied the two cases I mentioned in my member statement was done from a desk by departmental staff here in Yellowknife. A staff member who probably has no medical background, who dictates to our communities at large. Is this a professional medical practice that the minister approves of?
Thank you, Member for Thabacha. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The role of the Medical Travel Office is to ensure that the medical travel policy is being administered consistently and is intended by the policy. When a clinician makes a recommendation for a non-medical escort, the reason for the escort is written on the form and often accompanied by a letter providing further explanation. I have full confidence in the Medical Travel Office's ability to determine if the reason aligns with the criteria that is listed in the policy. When medical travel staff deny coverage for non-medical escort benefits, there's often a follow-up communication between the clinicians and the medical travel staff to confirm the escort decision. There's also an exceptions policy and appeals policy to consider unique circumstances and to ensure the policy is being applied as intended. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Tlabatcha.
Mr. Speaker, supporting our doctors in their decisions has always been a priority on behalf of the members of Tlabatcha and the N.W.T. Does the Minister feel doctors' decisions for a medical escort is vital and valid?
Thank you, Member for Tlabatcha. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, I mentioned the doctor's role is essential to the implementation of the medical travel policy. However, doctors have a role as advocates for their patients and sometimes make recommendations for non-medical escorts that do not align with the criteria in the policy and would lead to significant inconsistencies in the benefits that provide one patient over another. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, Member for Tlabatcha.
Mr. Speaker, a complete evaluation of this department's medical travel policy should be done in favor of a doctor's professional opinion and the patient's well-being. When will this be done?
Thank you, Member for Tlabatcha. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We revised some of the medical travel policies in 2019, and we will continue to work with this over the next year. I'll keep the member and the Standing Committee on Social Development updated on this work and provide a briefing at the appropriate time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Kamloops.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My questions today are for the Minister of the Housing Corporation. Mr. Speaker, long-range energy plans, community land use, and community wellness plans are completed independently, as are economic development and resource management strategies. Will the Minister commit to working with her colleagues to bring these planning exercises together and complete all communities within the 19th Legislative Assembly? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Kamloops. Minister responsible for the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can work with my Cabinet colleagues to have the discussion, but I cannot commit that all 33 community plans will be completed within the 4 years. And also I will continue the conversation with my Cabinet to go forward because looking at those community plans, Indigenous partnership is my priority going forward to offer adequate housing throughout the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Kamloops.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the Minister's commitment to have the discussion. My next question is, do the long-range housing plans currently done by the Housing Corporation account for the changing demographics of an age and population in each community in the N.W.T, especially as it relates to women, women with children, people with disabilities, and elders? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Kamloops. Minister responsible for the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the member please repeat her question? Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Kamloops.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm wondering if the current housing plans for the N.W.T Housing Corporation include the changing demographics of our population, particularly age, and also as it relates to women with children, people with disabilities, and elders. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Kamloops. Minister responsible for the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Northwest Territories does recognize there is an increase of population throughout the territory. We have identified programs to deal with the increase of population and the unique scenarios that we acquire throughout the Northwest Territories, and wanting to look at seniors aging in place and a safe program that provides renovations to clients who are homeowners, privately homeowners, and looking at replacement of fuel tanks. But also, I would like to also include that we do have a rent subsidy program that is used throughout Yellowknife, throughout this area, just because of the lack of public housing units that we do have currently. Going forward, I would like to work with the member to look at initiatives for for the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation, what we can elaborate in program improvement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Kamloops.
Mr. Speaker, I'm always ready to have a conversation about housing, so I appreciate that. Is the minister prepared to work with communities and Indigenous governments to re-examine the definition of core housing and develop metrics of success appropriate to the challenges we face in the 21st century? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Kamloops. Minister responsible for the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Housing Corporation is housing throughout the Northwest Territories is something I'm very passionate about, and throughout the term and the time being within the portfolio, I was really excited to hear that one of my communities in the Sawtooth, Fort Good Hope, has entered into an agreement, and they were able to establish housing programs independently, accessing federal dollars. Going forward, I look at looking at the housing initiative programs that are currently offered, and one of the things that I would like to do is elaborate on them, and advertisement is a key for me and for the Housing Corporation, so that we're able to meet the needs of the people of the Northwest Territories. Also reflecting and looking at the housing plans, I'm quite excited for those to be completed. We do have 33 communities, but those community plans, housing strategic plans, will be able to identify the housing needs throughout the Northwest Territories, and it's community-based information where the community is telling us what it is that they need. We as a government can provide the assistance and the work in partnership with the Indigenous groups and with the communities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, member for Kamloops.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Yellowknife housing is becoming ever less affordable. How will the minister improve the affordability of housing in Yellowknife over the course of the 19th Legislative Assembly? Thank you.
Thank you, member for Kamloops. Minister responsible for the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to elaborate on the housing programs that are offered currently. For the Yellowknife area, I look at the rent subsidy program that is offered. There is a name change to that. We will continue be offering it as after April 1st. I would like to work with a colleague and just elaborate a little bit more on the programs that are offered for Yellowknife. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife North. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Previously in this Assembly, I tabled a letter from the Chief of Colville Lake, once again asking the N.W.T. to leave the negotiating table so that Canada and that nation can reach a bilateral self-government agreement. My question is to the Honourable Premier. Have our negotiators been provided updated mandates at the negotiating table?
Thank you, member for Haver North. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, mandate direction on negotiating tables change quite often. They're based on what we think will happen. Anything that has a change, if it's going to impact finances or land or anything, has to come through Cabinet. It's not a decision that negotiators can make at the table. I know a lot of people think that it should be, but the reality is if it costs money, it has to come through a Cabinet table. So they're constantly being updated on a regular basis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have consistently heard from a number of Indigenous governments that the unilateral imposition of our government's core principles and objectives in regards to self-government negotiations has become a barrier. My question is for the Minister, the Honourable Premier. Have we updated our core principles and objectives in regards to self-government?
Thank you, member for Yellowknife North. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No, it's been quite a while actually since we updated our core principles and objectives. They actually arose from an obligation from the Clecho Agreement, is where they came from. They're actually very simple. They're very simple principles, and our issue is that there has to be some kind of standard of care or principles that go across. So it's not as easy as just changing them to meet the whim. We also have to take in Canada's legislation as well. So, for example, the Canada Health Act has principles that need to be taken into the new Canada legislation that's coming out with Child and Family Services has principles and standards that have to be taken into consideration. So although we want to work closely with our Indigenous governments and we're looking at a new way of doing business, we can't forget that there are three parties at this table, often with the negotiations, that it's the Northwest Territories, the Indigenous government, and Canada. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm well aware that there's three parties at the table, and to not update our core principles and objectives because there are federal government issues seems to miss the point, and that is that the federal government's whole purpose at being at the table. My question is for the Honourable Premier. Are we willing to reopen our core principles and objectives and negotiate them with Indigenous governments, considering our commitment to implement UNDRIP?
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife North. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During the member's opening speech, I heard him say, and I might misquote him, so correct me if I do, that he said there's two kinds of workers, one that work for the government workers, they get a lot of CCs. I happen, now that I'm Premier, get a lot of CCs, in all honesty. I wish I didn't get as many. And there's ones that work for the goals of the government. I came in here 4 years ago to actually make change. And it shows that I make change. These wrinkles that I have in my face did not come honestly. They came from hard work at this table. So I've already met with the Indigenous governments. I'm changing the way I do practice. I've called them all when I first started. I'm meeting with them. We're switching up even the way we seat. It used to be sit them against us, and now we're sitting as a group. I've changed up our bilaterals. I've scared them all. I've said after our bilaterals are done, let's, the chief and I, sit together and talk about the negotiations, what's going on, what's happening. It's scary for them as well. They don't know where this Premier is coming from. The point is this Premier is looking for change. We've been going on some of these negotiations 30-some years, and I do take the government to government does not mean to me federal government, territorial government, and at the bottom, Indigenous government. Government to government to me means federal government, N.W.T government, and Indigenous government all working together at the same level. So yes, I am totally open to changing whatever we need to do to work better with Indigenous governments and to work towards self-government and land claims agreements. That is my ultimate goal. And I will forgive this House for any extra wrinkles that I get because of trying to achieve my goal. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Oral questions. Member for Framley.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Forgive me if I look like a prune today, but I want to go back to the issue of the Cantong mine and Mactung that I raised yesterday. So my questions are for the Minister of Lands today, though. I'd like to know whether N.W.T had the surface lease covering the Cantong mine as a result of devolution. I'd like to know whether we've turned that back to the federal government now. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Framlake. Minister responsible for lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Canada is fully responsible for the administration of all surface leases and reserves that exist on the tungsten or Cantong site, including inspections. Administrative arrangements at Cantong are now consistent with other federal managed waste sites under the devolution agreement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Framlake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that because I asked many times in the last Assembly about whether that surface lease had been turned back, so it sounds like it has. That's good news. But I want to know if there's any residual liabilities that accrue to this government as a result of the Cantong mine, and that includes environmental liabilities. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Framlake. Minister responsible for lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Government of Canada is responsible for the management of the Cantong mine, including care and maintenance and remediation. The Cantong mine is a federal is a federal area under the Mackenzie Valley Resource Management Act. This means that the N.W.T does not have designated authority hold security for licenses and permits. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that. I think the shorter version of that was that we have no liability for the Cantong site, but I'll deal with that offline. I'd like to know from the Minister, if I can, Mr. Speaker, why this government, N.W.T, accepted the Mactung property as part of the financial security for the Cantong mine when it was in operation. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the business assets for Mactung tungsten deposits were purchased by the government of the Northwest Territories in order to recover debts owed to the N.W.T under the Cantong Reclamation Security Agreement. Mr. Speaker, the government of Northwest Territories took this approach to preserve the security originally accepted by Canada and to maximize its value. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that response. I don't think he really answered my question, though. I want to know why we accepted Mactung as part of the security arrangement for the Cantong mine. This minister had, the previous minister had full discretion to accept anything, any form of financial security. So why did this government accept the Mactung mine as part of this financial security? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is my understanding that the two properties were there, and to make sure that the federal government fulfilled their commitment, part of the devolution agreement, that we purchased these two properties to do that. So I will make a commitment to the member to go out and get further information on this, because that's my understanding presently, and if there's further information, I will get that too. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Colleagues, our time for oral questions has expired. Oral questions. Oral questions. Written questions. Written questions. Returns to written questions. Returns to written questions. Replies to Commissioner's address. Replies to the Commissioner's address. Petitions. Petitions. Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to table the following two documents. Supplementary estimates, infrastructure expenditures number 3, 2019-2020, and supplementary estimates, operations expenditures number 4, 2019-2020. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister of Finance. Tabling of documents. Minister responsible for Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following document, N.W.T. Cumulative Impact Monitoring Program 2018-19 Annual Report. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Tabling of documents. Member for Thabacha.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to table three documents: an email from the Thabacha constituency regarding medical travel escort denial, 2, reply from the EA on behalf of the Minister Tom regarding the above constituent, and 3, the ministerial policy on medical travel escort criteria, exceptions, and the appeal process. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Thabacha. Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Notices of motion. Notices of motion. Member for Trinity Welding.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I give notice that on Thursday, February 13th, 2020, I will move the following motion. Now, therefore, I move, seconded by the member for Hay River North, that table document 12-19 sub 2, 2019 to 2023, mandate of the Government of the Northwest Territories be referred to Committee of the Whole for consideration. And Mr. Speaker, at the appropriate time, I will be seeking unanimous consent to deal with this motion today. Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Norton, notice is a motion. Notice is a motion. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the change to our House sitting where we will have next week for members to return to their constituencies, I give notice that on Thursday, February 13th, 2020, I will move the following motion. I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Hay River North, that notwithstanding Rule 4, when this House adjourns on Thursday, February 13th, 2020, it shall be adjourned until Tuesday, February 25th, 2020. And further, that any time prior to February 25th, 2020, if the Speaker is satisfied after consultation with the Executive Council and members of the Legislative Assembly that the public interest requires that the House should meet at an earlier time during the adjournment, the Speaker may give notice, and thereupon the House shall meet at the time stated in such notice and shall transact its business and has been duly adjourned to that time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Notice is a motion. Notice is a motion. Motions. Motions. Member for Tunade-Welday.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to deal with a motion I gave notice of earlier today. Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Norton. The member for Tunade-Welday is seeking unanimous consent to deal with motion 2-19(2). Today, are there any nays? There are no nays. Mr. Norton, you may deal with the motion.
Mr. Speaker. Whereas table document 12-19 sub 2, 2019 to 2023, mandate of the Government of the Northwest Territories has been tabled in this House. And whereas the 2019 to 2023 mandate of the Government of the Northwest Territories requires detailed consideration. Now therefore I move, seconded by the member for Hay River North, that table document 12-19 sub 2, 2019 to 2023 mandate of the Government of the Northwest Territories be referred to Committee of the Whole for consideration. Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The motion is in order to the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Motions. Motions. Notice is a motion for the first reading of bills. Notice is a motion for the first reading of bills. First reading of bills. First reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Consideration of Committee of the Whole of Bills and Other Matters, a table document 16-19(2), Supplementary Estimates, Infrastructure Expenditure number 3, 2019-2020, with member for Inuvik Twin Lakes in the chair.
All right. I will now call Committee of the Whole to order. What is the wish of the committee? Mr. Norn?
Oh, my apologies. Force the habit. Madam Chair, the committee wishes to consider table document 16-19 sub 2, supplementary estimates on infrastructure expenditures number 3, 2019 to 2020. Madam Chair.
Does the committee agree? Okay. Thank you, committee. We will take a short recess and resume with the table document. 19-2 supplementary estimates, infrastructure expenditures, number 3, 2019-2020. Does the Minister of Finance have any opening remarks?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like today to present the supplementary estimates, infrastructure expenditures, number 3, 2019-2020. The supplementary estimates document proposes an increase of $1.3 million comprising of the following items. $418,000 for an enclosed cab snow blower for the Fort Smith Airport that is fully funded by the Government of Canada's Airport Capital Assistance Program. $400,000 to initiate work under the Surface Structures Adaptation for Climate Resilience Project Agreement at the Mike Zubko Airport in Nunavik. This project is 75% funded by the Government of Canada's Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund. $280,000 for 1 vehicle and 3 patrol boats for the establishment of 3 protected areas under the Nature Fund Agreement, the costs of which are offset by Environment and Climate Change Canada. And $200,000 to commence initial environmental assessment and planning work to inform the construction of an all-weather road from Highway 4 to Lockhart Lake within the Slave Geologic Province corridor under the National Trade Corridors Fund. Those are my opening remarks, Madam Chair. I'd be happy to answer any questions that the committee might have.
Thank you, Minister. We have agreed to begin with general comments. Does the Minister of Finance wish to bring witnesses into the House? Yes. Thank you, Sergeant at Arms. Please escort the witnesses to the chamber. Would the Minister please introduce her witnesses?
Thank you, Madam Chair. With me this afternoon, I have the Jamie Cooey, Deputy Secretary to the Financial Management Board, and Terence Corterale, the Director of the Management Board Secretariat.
Thank you. I will now open the floor for general comments, and the members have 10 minutes. Anyone? All right. Seeing no general comments, we will proceed to a review of the supplementary estimates by department. We will begin with Department of Environment and Natural Resources. I will now open the floor to general comments on the Department of Environment and Natural... Did I just read that again? Nope. I will now open the floor to general comments on the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. Oh, Mr. All right, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, or Madam Chair. So, can the minister tell us what these 3 patrol boats are for?
Minister.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, there's 3 jet boats and 1 truck that are being purchased for the operations and management of 3 Indigenous and territorial protected areas. The Taidene Nene, Tsuntene Nile Tuyeta. I'm looking over this way for some help. And Dinaga Weke Hodi. I will practice over the course of Indigenous Languages Month, Madam Chair.
Member O'Reilly.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So appreciate that information from the Minister. I understand that this is federal money. What's the term of the agreement and when is it going to end? Thanks, Madam Chair.
Minister of Finance.
Madam Chair, this is a 4-year, 4 fiscal term agreement, and so it will be running until 2023. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing the member, so I might, I think I may have missed some of his question, I will put my earpiece on. I apologize if I didn't hear all of it.
Member O'Reilly.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I appreciate the response from the Minister. So what happens after 2023 if there are capital needs for these 3 protected areas? And as I understand it, there's going to be a plan, like a master plan or a plan developed for each of these. Presumably, there's going to be some efforts to encourage local business development, tourism with these new protected areas. What happens after 4 years if there's capital needs for these areas? Are we going to have to go to the federal government cap in hand, or is this something that we would start to fund ourselves? Madam Speaker.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a little more faith in the system, perhaps insofar as the nature of the 3 protected areas are such that they are investments by the Government of Northwest Territories as well as the federal government, and in partnership with the Indigenous communities and Indigenous governments of those areas. So I'm perhaps a little bit more optimistic as to their future and the future partnerships between the governments. I can note for the member that Environment and Natural Resources is continuing ongoing research into the long-term planning in order to ensure that there is a bridge over any funding gaps that might arise over the course of or after the 2023 point in time. So while that's not a complete answer, I can assure the member that the department is alive to his concerns.
Member O'Reilly.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks to the Minister for those. I have lots of confidence in our Indigenous governments and their ability to protect these areas, plan for them, and so on. I'm not as confident, though, when it comes to our government. When I continued to ask questions in the last Assembly about where the money was going to come from and how much our government was prepared to dedicate to Thai Dene Nene, for example, I was told that our total commitment was $190,000 a year. So that's what I'm concerned about, is our commitment as a government to these areas, not everybody else's. So just to clarify that for the ministers, and I don't expect a response, but I will certainly be watching this very carefully moving forward to make sure that our government continues to invest in these areas as part of our economic diversification. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Minister of Finance.
Madam Chair, I don't have any particular specific reply other than to reassure that certainly over the next 4 years this is a joint contribution, and that the Government of Northwest Territories continues to contribute and support these protected areas.
All right. Thank you, Minister. Is there any more questions? Mr. Bonneroche.
Yes, I note in here that Fort Smith Airport is getting an enclosed cab snowblower, and it's listed at $418,000. In the other climate change ones, you got 3 patrol boats and a vehicle for $280,000. I'm not sure what kind of a snowblower this is. Can you provide some details as to why it is $418,000? Let's see.
We're on the $280,000 commitment. Is there questions for the minister? Sorry, Member Bonneroche. To the Environment, Natural Resource Stewardship and Climate, not previously authorized $280,000 commitment? No. Okay. Any other? Nope. Okay. So this one here. All right. So committee, are we going through the detail? Okay. Sorry. Committee will begin at page 6 of the detail. Environment, Natural Resource, Environment, Stewardship, and Climate Change, not previously authorized, $280,000. Does committee agree? Agree. Okay. Thank you, committee. Environment and Natural Resource Environment Stewardship and Climate Change, not previously authorized, $280,000. Does committee agree? We will now go to page 7. Infrastructure Asset Management, not previously authorized, $200,000. Does committee agree? Oh, question Member O'Reilly.
Thanks, Madam Chair. So can someone tell me what this $200,000 for initial work on an environmental assessment, what that's actually going to be spent on and what is it going to accomplish? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, this is the contribution of the N.W.T towards the project. A larger proportion of the amount is being funded by the federal government under the National Trade Corridors Fund. This was a successful application by the government of the Northwest Territories for this partnership with the federal government. And as a totality, this part of the Slave Geologic Province will fund quite a number of things. There will be the initial environmental assessment, which will include studies, everything ranging potentially from water use, water quality, wildlife, permafrost, fish studies, air quality, as well as business opportunities using both scientific method as well as traditional knowledge. There is some pre-planning work that is to be done in terms of engineering, although the route analysis has been determined under prior funding. The next stage is actually to do in order to bring the matter to being shovel-ready, as well, of course, and perhaps most importantly, is consultation with Indigenous governments and to ensure that there's a thorough consultation plan in place and that work gets underway so that all Indigenous governments and Indigenous communities are part of this process from the earliest possible stages. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Member O'Reilly.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks to the Minister for that. So what's the total cost of this project? Thanks, Madam Chair.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the total cost year over year, I can give the cost. In terms of 2019-20, the total cost is $200,000. Then up to going forward, it reaches $40 million over the course of the 4-year plan. I assume that was the timeline that the member is asking. I'm prepared to go into other detail if he's looking for other numbers.
Thank you, Minister. Member O'Reilly.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Yes, I would like the total amount to construct this project. I understand that the planning phase, so to speak, phase 1 is $40 million. What's the cost for the rest of it? Thanks, Madam Chair.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am aware that there have been studies compiled and work has been done. I would just like to confirm what stage those numbers are at in terms of where they're at in terms of their publication. I can, as I said, I can confirm that this is a $40 million estimate for phase 1 of the project. There are other phases to the project, and I'll just confirm the status of those numbers. And if I can release them, I certainly will. So I apologize, I'm not familiar enough with where those studies are at.
Thank you. Member O'Reilly.
Thanks, Madam Chair. So I'm trying to understand what the Minister said. Is she going to be able to provide to the House information on the total cost of this project, and that will come shortly? Thanks, Madam Chair.
Minister of Finance.
Madam Chair, I simply, as I've just said, and I'll say it again, as soon as I can confirm whether or not the cost estimates are confidential, then if they're not, then I will be more than happy to bring them to the House.
Thank you, Minister. Member O'Reilly.
Thanks, Madam Chair. So can the Minister tell us whether there's actually a full project description or a business case for this project? Thanks, Madam Chair.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, there was, in order to partake of the Trade Corridors Fund, there was a complete business case assessment done. It was my understanding that quite a bit of that information was shared during the last Assembly, but I'm sure that what was sent to prior committees can be resent to the current committees as they are constituted, so that the information about the business case can be provided.
Thank you, Minister. Member O'Reilly.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Yeah, I was a member of the last Assembly, and we received a lot of information, some of which was about this particular project, but I don't actually ever recall seeing a business case for it. So if the Minister can commit to share that, that would be great. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Minister of Finance.
So, Madam Chair, I am, as I've said, I am confident there has been a cost-benefit analysis and a business case provided. So what I would do first is to identify what was shared with the last committee, ensure that the current composition of the committees have that information available to them, and certainly if what was shared before was unsatisfactory, then we'll have to go back and confirm so that the committee can be assured of the analysis of the cost benefits, of the very positive cost benefits of the Slave Geologic Province to the Northwest Territories.
Thank you. Member O'Reilly.
Thanks, Madam Chair. So just one last question perhaps. Can the Minister tell me whether any of this $200,000 or indeed any of the $40 million is actually going to be used to protect caribou and their habitat? Thanks, Madam Chair.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So certainly, as I mentioned, in order to have this project being shovel-ready, it will require a baseline studies to understand the current situation facing the wildlife and in the area and in the region, as well as conducting whatever studies will be no doubt required for the environmental assessment process that I expect would be required for this kind of level of project. So that part of the money will be going precisely to do that, is to engage in that process, to engage in that study, to ensure that we have the baseline data and to ensure that we are prepared going forward with an environmental assessment so that this project can move forward in a way that is respectful and of all of the needs of all the people in the territory. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Member O'Reilly.
Thanks, Madam Chair. So, look, I need to be clear. In the last Assembly, I said I don't support this kind of, or this particular project when we don't have a comprehensive plan in place and funded to protect the Bathurst caribou herd, which is down to 8,200 animals. So until our government gets serious about habitat protection and has that plan fully implemented, in place, going, funded, and so on, I will not be supporting this expenditure of funds. We can't have an all-weather road through critical habitat, including the N.W.T portion, which is a slightly different project, go through the calving grounds of this herd when they're at such a low level. So I won't be supporting this. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Minister of Finance, do you have any?
Madam Chair, I appreciate the member's candid remarks. At the same time, I can only assure the House, broadly speaking, that this is a project that is of tremendous significance to the Northwest Territories. It is, as I understand, supported over in the Kitikmeot region of the Nunavut, that it is being done under a business case and with a cost-benefit analysis. It is multi-departmental. It will involve ENR and it will involve lands. So I'm sure that there will be plenty of opportunity, whether through this project or through the other work of the other departments, to review the impacts on the caribou as it goes forward. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My understanding is that the business plan and the feasibility of this project is largely contingent on the Grays Bay Port project in Nunavut going ahead. I see here that the environmental assessment is only to take us the road to the Nunavut border. Is that correct, that we are conducting environmental assessment as if the Nunavut half is not going ahead?
Minister.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Our environmental assessment takes us to the Nunavut border. As I've said earlier, there is going to be most likely some partnership ongoing with Nunavut and the Kitikmeot side, but that portion of it would be, I presume, under their jurisdiction to manage. The viability of this project and the importance of this project to the Northwest Territories relates entirely to the possibility and the potential within the Northwest Territories. There are believed to be tremendous mineral resources within this Slave geologic area. This is an opportunity to, in fact, study this area from that perspective, as well as to study this area far more effectively in terms of the wildlife and the environment and the fish and the waters. So being able to access this entire massive geological region and geographic region more effectively will be of tremendous benefit to the Northwest Territories. So in short, it is not only dependent on what's happening in Grays Bay, and it is for that reason that it is, but it is also beneficial to the Northwest Territories, notwithstanding that it only goes to the Nunavut border. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My concern is that we're seeing here a scoping of the environmental assessment that does not factor in the potential of the Grays Bay half. We know that the Bathurst Caribou calving grounds is in Nunavut, and caribou do not respect borders. So my concern here is that we are now setting ourselves up for essentially the resource boards to say that we have scoped the project wrong. It also, those mineral deposits, and there's no doubt there's minerals there, are largely dependent on the port access. So I question the scoping of this project to not include the entirety of the project. Can the minister provide us with an update of the status of the Nunavut half of this project?
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, Madam Chair, there's a lot to unpack in the member's comment. I'm not in a position in the context of a supplementary appropriation that is involving the scoping of the Northwest Territories project in a position to commit to what may or may not be happening in the Nunavut side, other than to assure again that this is envisioned as being a partnership with Nunavut. It is indeed something that is of an Arctic nature, and putting Canada as a country into being more of an actual Arctic country in terms of actually exploring and connecting all of our Arctic regions. So I am confident that there will be ongoing partnership and dialogue with Nunavut and with the Government of Canada. With respect to transportation of minerals, again, it is not entirely contingent or dependent on Grays Bay. The ability to transport over land would certainly make viable the potential for development and for mineral resource development in the Slave geologic area. You know, I can't speak to what different mine sites might look like and whether or not a Grays Bay site or whether a transportation corridor over land is going to be more viable for the individual operation. That is theoretical at this point. This is frankly exactly why we want, in part, to be doing a proper technical study of the area to understand exactly what is there and how it can best be accessed. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Are there any other questions? Mr. Bonarosh.
Yes, getting back to your your snow blower. Pardon?
Next activity. You gotta wait. We're only on the 200 asset management. No other questions on this, so I'll reread it. Infrastructure asset management not previously authorized for $200,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. So we will move on. We will move on to infrastructure programs and services not previously authorized. $818,000. Does the committee agree? Oh, Mr. Bonarosh has questions. Snow blower.
Back to third try. Yeah, it's the price of this snow blower there. I'm just wondering if there's a, because you're saying there's a medium, so I imagine there's a small one, and there also is a large one. So I don't know if there's any prices for any of those sizes. At the same time, too, why would you need a snow blower if you're going to be dealing with a lot of snow? You would pretty much be using a snow plow or a grader. Can you provide some details on this item? Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Bonnerouche. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Interestingly, as I understand it right now at the airport in Fort Smith, they are in fact using the grader and snow blower and other machinery, and that by investing with funds that are fully offset by Transport Canada, they will actually be freeing up the machinery to do other work in the community. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Bonnerouche.
Yeah, maybe just a follow-up. Because it's a snow blower, it's blowing snow, so you've got maybe 100 feet across there. Where are you blowing the snow as you're moving around? So, and then why wouldn't you use the plow and the grader type of thing? So I'm not sure about the snow blower myself, but yeah, if you could just clarify that, I understand. Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Bonnerouche. Minister of Finance, do you want to answer that?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, it's obviously they're viable, important questions to understand it. I guess the one thing I would point to is this did go to tender. So as far as being the appropriate machinery for purpose and as being a competitive price for purpose, I would simply point to the tendering process and place faith in that for the purposes of this current appropriation. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right. Do you, Mr. Bonnerouche, did you have any other? No? Okay. So no other questions? Okay. I will go back. Infrastructure programs and services not previously authorized, $818,000. Does the committee agree? All right. Thank you, committee. Infrastructure total department not previously authorized, $1,018,000. Does the committee agree? Agree. All right. Thank you, Minister, and our thanks to the witnesses for appearing before us. Sergeant at Arms, where is he? Please escort. Yeah. From the chamber. Okay. The motion is in order. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All. Oh, sorry. I'm ahead of the guy. I'm ahead of the game. Norm.
Okay, must show, Madam Chair, to the committee motion. So I move that consideration of table document 16-19 sub 2, supplementary estimates, infrastructure expenditures, number 3, 2019 to 2020 be now concluded, and that table document 16-19 sub 2 be reported and recommended as ready for further consideration in formal session through the form of an appropriation bill. Mr. Madam Chair.
Yep. Thank you. So the motion is in order. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. Table document 16-19-2 will be reported as ready for consideration and formal session through the form of an appropriation bill. What is the will of the committee, Mr. Norn?
Mr. Chair, Madam Chair, I request that the Chair rise and report progress.
Okay. There's a motion on the floor to report progress. The motion is in order and non-debatable. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. I will now rise and report progress.
Report on Committee of the Whole. Member for N.W.T. Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, your committee has been considering table document 16-19-2 supplementary estimates infrastructure expenditures number 3 2019 to 2020, and I would like to report that that consideration of table document 16-19-2 is concluded and that the House concur in those estimates and that appropriation bill to be based thereon be introduced without delay. And Mr. Speaker, I move that the report of the Committee of the Whole be concurred with. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Here, do we have a seconder? Member for Mumfway. Third reading of bills. Huh? Oh, sorry. Motion is in order. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. Third reading of bills. Third reading of bills. Orders of the day. Mr. Clerk.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Orders of the day, Wednesday, February 12, 2020, 1:30 p.m. Prayer, minister statements, member statements, return to oral questions, recognition of visitors in the gallery, acknowledgments, oral questions, returns to written questions, replies to the Commissioner's address, petitions, report of committee on the review of bills, reports of standing and special committees, tabling of documents, notices of motion, motions, notices of motion for the first reading of bills, first reading of bills, second reading of bills, consideration in committee of the whole of bills and other matters, table document 12-19-2, table document 17-19-2, report of committee of the whole, third reading of bills, orders of the day.
This House stands adjourned until Wednesday, February 12, 2020 at 1:30 p.m.